My name is Doyle. I'm 36 years old, a Major General in the United States Marine Corps. On the day my brother was decorated with the Silver Star, I wasn't even on the guest list. As my family's SUV glided past, my father, Colonel Donovan Doyle, didn't look at me. He simply spoke to the guard, his voice cold as ice. "She is not with us." My mother turned away, and my brother, Caleb, the golden boy of the Marine Corps, flashed a smirk. That smile said it all. "You see, you don't belong here." What they didn't know was that in a few short hours, on that very same stage, I would be awarded the Navy Cross, and their commanders would call me by a name they never dared to imagine: Major General Doyle. Have you ever been made to feel like a stranger by your own family? Have you ever had to swallow your tears while the ones you love most twist the knife? If so, hit that like button so I know I'm not alone. And tell me in the comments just a simple yes or no. This story is for you. And I promise, the revenge will be sweet. The North Carolina sun was a physical weight pressing down on the starched, unforgiving wool of my dress blues. Each perfect crease of the midnight blue tunic felt like a tiny blade against my skin, and a single bead of sweat traced a slow, irritating path down my temple. I stood alone at the main gate of Camp Lejeune, the sprawling heart of the Marine Corps on the East Coast, feeling the humid air stick to my lungs. The young lance corporal at the guard post had the earnest, flustered look of someone who knew he was in the presence of a senior officer but was bound by his orders. He kept checking his clipboard, his brow furrowed in concentration. My name wasn't on it, of course, it wasn't. Then the black SUV pulled up. It was the new model, the kind my father bought to signal his status as a retired but still important colonel. He didn't even bother to lower his window. Through the tinted glass, I saw his silhouette, rigid, uncompromising. He made a curt gesture to the guard, a flick of the wrist that dismissed my entire existence. His voice cut through the air, loud enough for me to hear, intended for me to hear. "She is not with us. Proceed as required." A knot of ice formed in my stomach. I glanced at the passenger window. My mother, Genevieve, was a blur of floral silk and averted eyes. She stared intently at something on the dashboard, her hands clasped in her lap, a portrait of willful ignorance. She wouldn't meet my gaze. To acknowledge me would be to acknowledge the cruelty of the moment, and my mother's entire life was built on avoiding conflict, on maintaining a fragile, artificial peace. In the back seat, Caleb leaned forward, my younger brother, the celebrated captain, the man of the hour. He caught my eye and a slow, triumphant smirk spread across his face. It was a look I knew well, the look of the golden child, the victor in a war I never even knew we were fighting. It was pure, unadulterated contempt. The heavy iron gate groaned open for them. The SUV slid through without a pause. And then, with a deafening clang that echoed the slamming of a door in my soul, the gate swung shut in my face. The sound was a final, brutal confirmation of my place in the Doyle family. I was an outsider. The young guard cleared his throat, his face a mask of professional discomfort. "Ma'am, I'm sorry, but if you're not on the list..." He didn't have to finish. Just as the humiliation began to burn hot in my chest, a different vehicle approached. It was a sleek, black government SUV, immaculate and imposing, with the 4-star flag of a full general mounted on its fender. It stopped silently beside me. The rear door opened and General Alistair Finch emerged, his presence commanding the attention of the entire gate detail. He was a legend in the Corps, a man whose reputation was built on both battlefield brilliance and unwavering integrity. He didn't just shake my hand. In a move that sent a ripple of shock through the guards, he put a warm, fatherly arm around my shoulders. "Major General, I was about to send out a search party for you," he boomed, his voice a perfect blend of authority and genuine affection. He emphasized my rank, his eyes flicking for a brief second to the stunned guards. The contrast was a physical blow. The icy dismissal from my own father versus the warm, public embrace from a 4-star general. The gesture wasn't a rescue. It didn't erase the sting. Instead, it was a bitter, painful confirmation of a truth I had lived with for years. I had been forced to find my family in the barracks and command centers of the world, because the one I was born into had refused me. General Finch personally escorted me past the now saluting guards. He didn't lead me toward the reserved family seating, where I could see 3 empty chairs next to my parents and brother. Instead, he guided me down the center aisle toward the front row VIP section. As we approached, colonels and fellow generals rose to their feet with nods of respect. I took my seat directly across the aisle from them. The distance was only a few feet, but it felt like miles. I could feel their eyes on me. I didn't need to look to know what was happening. I could sense my father's stunned disbelief, his face tightening as he tried to process why his desk jockey daughter was being seated among the Corps' most powerful leaders. I could feel my mother's anxious confusion, her hands probably twisting the program into a mangled mess. And I could feel Caleb's simmering resentment, his perfect day suddenly, inexplicably, tainted. My father leaned over, whispering something sharp and angry to my brother. The psychological game had begun, and for the first time in my life, I knew it was a battle I could not afford to lose. The ceremony dragged on. Speeches were made, praises were sung. Finally, it was Caleb's turn. He strode onto the stage, the picture of a Marine hero, his chest puffed out. He accepted the silver star, the polished metal gleaming under the stage lights. He began his speech, his voice smooth and confident. He thanked our father, calling him the greatest Marine I've ever known. He thanked our mother, his rock and rear guard. He thanked his wife, Hannah, who gave a small, nervous wave from her seat. He never mentioned my name. It was an omission so loud, so deliberate, it sucked the air from my lungs. But he wasn't finished. He saved the final, sharpest blade for the end. He looked out over the audience, his eyes sweeping past me as if I were part of the empty space. "I want to dedicate this honor," he said, his voice ringing with false humility, "to the real warriors. The ones who aren't afraid to get their boots muddy on the battlefield. The ones who forged the legacy of the Marine Corps with sweat and blood, not the ones who push papers behind a desk." A wave of polite, oblivious applause filled the auditorium. They heard the words of a humble hero. I heard the truth. It was a public execution. A perfectly aimed, perfectly delivered slap in the face, meant for an audience of one. He stood there, soaking in the adoration, believing he had fired the final shot. He had no idea the war was just beginning. And as I sat there, the cold fury solidifying in my veins, I looked at the family that had cast me out and wondered, not for the first time, why it always had to be this way. The polite applause for Caleb's speech was a distant, hollow sound like rain on a tin roof. I sat frozen in the VIP section, the stiff collar of my uniform suddenly feeling like it was choking me. Across the aisle, my family formed a perfect, false tableau. My father nodded, his face a mask of stoic pride. My mother dabbed at a dry eye. Caleb accepted a pat on the back from his wife, Hannah. Looking at them sitting there, a portrait of the all-American military family, my mind couldn't help but drift away from the sterile auditorium, back to another table, another celebration. A Thanksgiving, a few years ago. The memory arrived with the phantom scent of roasted turkey and cinnamon-spiced pumpkin pie. We were in Fayetteville, in the house I grew up in, a place so close to Fort Bragg that the rumble of artillery practice was our childhood soundtrack. The kitchen was warm, filled with the golden light of late afternoon, but the air was thick with a familiar, suffocating tension. It was the kind of atmosphere that settles when everyone is playing a part. My father, Donovan, was holding court at the head of the table, a glass of bourbon in his hand. He was in his element, regaling the family with tales of Caleb's latest accomplishment. My brother had just completed the grueling Marine Corps Force Reconnaissance Selection, a feat of physical endurance my father spoke of with near-religious reverence. "Toughest training in the world," he declared, his voice booming with vicarious pride. "They push them to the absolute limit. That's a real Marine, a man who leads from the front." He took a long sip of his drink, then his eyes landed on me. I had just returned from a classified intelligence mission in the Middle East, a detail I couldn't share, a success that had to remain invisible. He smirked. "And how about you, Marin?" he asked, his tone dripping with a familiar, playful condescension. Still pushing papers at the Pentagon? I'll bet this turkey has seen more action than you have. A wave of polite, obligatory laughter rippled around the table. It was a joke they had all heard before. The punchline was always the same. My work was less real, less valuable. My contribution wasn't measured in sweat and mud, but in strategic briefs and data analysis. To my father, it was all abstract, safe, feminine. I felt my spine curve, my shoulders slump. I stared down at my plate, at the swirl of creamy mashed potatoes, suddenly finding the pattern intensely fascinating. In those moments, I would make myself small, invisible. If I didn't react, the moment would pass. That was the rule. My rule. My mother, Genevieve, ever the nervous peacekeeper, jumped in. "Oh, Donovan, don't say that," she said, her voice light and placating. "Marin is doing important work, and it's safe. As a mother, I'm just glad she doesn't have to be out in the field like Caleb." Her words, meant as a shield, were just another kind of dagger. Coated in the sweet poison of motherly concern, the message was clear. My path was chosen from fear, not strength. I was the fragile one needing protection, while Caleb was the brave one sent into danger. Her support erased every ounce of courage it took to thrive in my world, invalidating the sleepless nights, the immense pressure, the life-or-death decisions made thousands of miles from any battlefield. I looked up at her, searching for understanding, but found only pity. The soft, sad look of a mother comforting a child who couldn't keep up. And in that moment, my silence was my consent. By not speaking up, I was agreeing with them. I was accepting their narrative that I was lesser. Caleb, basking in the glow of my father's praise, decided to add his own finishing touch. He picked up a slice of pumpkin pie from the dessert tray, walked around the table, and placed it on my plate with a grand, magnanimous gesture. "Have some more, sis," he said, his voice laced with mock concern. "All that sitting must take a lot of energy for thinking, huh?" It wasn't kindness. It was a power play. In front of everyone, he demonstrated my role. The passive recipient, the child to be cared for. He was the man of action, the hero, reinforcing his status by diminishing mine, all under the guise of brotherly affection. I felt my cheeks burn with a familiar, helpless shame. I kept my eyes fixed on my plate, my throat too tight to speak. The beautiful meal, the festive occasion, it all turned to ash in my mouth. It was Hannah, Caleb's new wife, who broke the spell. She had been a quiet observer, trying to learn the unspoken rules of her new family. She leaned forward, her expression genuinely curious, ignoring the charged atmosphere. She just looked at me and asked, "How is your work in Washington, Marin? It must be absolutely fascinating." It was a simple, normal question. But in that house, at that table, it was revolutionary. It was the only question I'd been asked all evening that wasn't a comparison or a judgment. It was directed at me, Marin, not Caleb's sister. It assumed my life had value on its own terms. I looked up, startled, and met her eyes. I saw no pity, only sincere interest. A warmth spread through my chest, a feeling so foreign in that room that it almost made me want to cry. I managed a small, grateful smile. "It has its moments," I said, my voice barely a whisper. That tiny exchange was a lifeline. A single, fragile seed of a different kind of family, one that could be built on respect. The memory faded, and I was back in the cold auditorium at Camp Lejeune. The applause had died. My family was getting ready to leave, their duty done. The pain from that Thanksgiving dinner felt as fresh as the humiliation I had suffered at the gate just hours before. The pattern was so clear, so deeply etched. For years, I had accepted it. I had stayed silent, made myself small, and swallowed their casual cruelty as if it were my daily bread. But looking at them now, I felt something shift inside me. The old, familiar ache of sadness was still there, but it was now joined by a cold, hard clarity. My silence hadn't brought peace. It had only given them permission to continue. It had taught them that I was a safe target for their jokes, their pity, their contempt. A question burned in my mind, a question I had been too afraid to ask myself for my entire life. If I didn't stand up for myself, who would? My answer to that question, if I didn't stand up for myself, who would, wasn't a confrontation. It wasn't a dramatic speech delivered across a Thanksgiving table. My answer was the quiet, relentless hum of a command center, half a world away from home. It was the taste of stale, black coffee at 3 in the morning and a resolve forged not in the heat of battle, but in the cold, blue light of a computer screen. My father's world was one of tangible things: the weight of a rifle, the mud on a pair of boots, the ground gained in a firefight. My world was abstract, a ghost world of data streams, satellite maps, and encrypted calls that bounced across continents. My battlefields were sterile, windowless rooms, the most significant of which was at Ramstein Air Base in Germany, the nerve center of U.S. military operations in Europe. My life there was a blur of 12, sometimes 18-hour shifts. I lived on caffeine and the adrenaline of looming deadlines. Sleep was a luxury, often found in short, jarring naps in a worn-out office chair, my head resting on a stack of classified documents. My team was the best in the world, a collection of brilliant, sleep-deprived analysts who could find a needle in a global haystack. But I was their commander. The weight of every decision, every piece of intelligence we sent up the chain, ultimately rested on my shoulders. I remember one night vividly. The air in the command center was thick with tension. We were tracking a high-value target, a notorious bomb maker, through a crowded city. The intelligence was solid, but the window of opportunity was closing fast. The call came down to me: authorize a drone strike. I stared at the screen, at the grainy infrared image of a vehicle moving through dark streets. Inside that vehicle was a man responsible for the deaths of dozens of soldiers. But around him were the sleeping, innocent lives of a city. My team fed me data: wind speed, potential collateral damage, probability of success. My job was to distill all of it into a single, irrevocable command. My hand trembled slightly as I reached for the secure phone, but my voice when I spoke was steady. Clear. Execute the mission. The silence that followed the confirmation was the loudest sound I had ever heard. In that moment, I wasn't a paper pusher. I was a warrior, fighting a war my father could never comprehend. When a mission was successful, the relief in the command center was palpable. My team would celebrate with tired cheers and cheap pizza ordered from the base food court. They deserved it. They had earned it. But I could never fully join in. The commander's burden is a solitary one. The weight of what if the intel was wrong, what if we missed something, never truly leaves you. It's a ghost that follows you from the command center back to your temporary apartment. My place in Ramstein was a sterile, impersonal box with gray walls and government-issue furniture. It was a place to sleep, not to live. On nights after a major operation, the silence was deafening. I would stand at the window, looking out at the lights of a foreign country, feeling an ache of profound loneliness. I wanted to call home. I wanted to share the crushing weight of my responsibility, or the soaring relief of a success. But what would I have been met with? A lecture from my father about the real military? A question from my mother about when I was going to find a husband and settle down? Another painful comparison to Caleb? So, I didn't call. I sat alone with my ghosts, with the quiet hum of the refrigerator for company. The loneliness of a leader is a unique and bitter vintage, one my family would never have the palate to understand. It was during one of those long, quiet nights that I discovered Brené Brown. I was scrolling through my laptop, looking for a distraction, and stumbled upon her TED Talk. I clicked play, not expecting much, but then she started talking, not as a polished motivational speaker, but as a flawed, funny, and brilliant human being. She spoke of courage, shame, and vulnerability. One line hit me like a physical blow. Vulnerability is not weakness. It's our greatest measure of courage. I played it again, and again. The words resonated in the empty apartment, filling the lonely space with a powerful truth. My entire life, I had seen my path as a defensive one, a reaction to my family's dismissal. But she was reframing it. Choosing a different path, one that wasn't understood or valued by my family, wasn't a weakness. Daring to enter an arena where I was constantly underestimated, where my contributions were invisible to the people who should have seen them most clearly. That was an act of profound courage. My vulnerability, the part of me that ached for their approval, wasn't something to be ashamed of. It was the source of my strength. I didn't need their applause to validate my life. I was already living what she called a daring, greatly life in the quiet solitude of my own arena. A few months later, my work on that drone strike operation earned me a commendation medal. It wasn't presented in a grand ceremony. It was a quiet affair in a general's office with only a handful of people present. The secrecy was part of the job. The general pinned the medal on my chest, shook my hand firmly, and said, "This country owes you a debt, Major." I held the medal in my hand on the flight back. It was heavy, the cool weight of the bronze a solid, tangible thing in my palm. It was real. It was recognition for the sleepless nights, the gut-wrenching decisions, the silent sacrifices. When I got home, I didn't frame it. I didn't mention it to my family on our stilted weekly phone call. Instead, I took out a small, unadorned wooden box from my closet. Inside, nestled on a bed of dark velvet, were a few other items. A challenge coin from a unit I'd supported, a previous commendation, a faded photograph of my first team. I gently placed the new medal inside, next to the others. I closed the lid. The click was soft, but final. That box became my secret treasury. It was my private proof of worth, a tangible history of my own making. It was a silent reminder, whenever I felt the sting of my family's disapproval, that my value wasn't up for their debate. It had already been forged, tested, and proven in quiet rooms thousands of miles from home. I was building my own legacy, one secret medal, one silent victory at a time. Every medal in that small wooden box had a story. But the Navy Cross, the one that rested on a bed of dark velvet, the one that meant the most, began not in a command center, but in a sterile briefing room at the Pentagon, under the watchful eyes of General Alistair Finch. I was a lieutenant colonel then, and I was in the process of being professionally crucified. I was presenting a new, high-risk intelligence strategy to the Joint Chiefs. The room was a sea of stern faces and decorated chests, a council of military gods. The air was thick with skepticism. My plan was unconventional, relying on predictive analytics and human intelligence in a way that challenged decades of established doctrine. It was exactly the kind of crazy desk jockey idea my father would have scoffed at. I could feel the doubt in the room. It was a cold, physical pressure. But one man listened differently. General Finch, a four-star legend with a quiet, imposing presence, didn't shift in his seat or trade skeptical glances with his peers. He leaned forward slightly, his eyes fixed on me, his attention absolute. He absorbed every word, every data point, every contingency plan. When I finished, a tense silence fell over the room. The first question was a thinly veiled attack on my lack of combat experience. Before I could even formulate a response, General Finch raised a hand, silencing the room. He didn't look at the man who had asked the question. He looked directly at me. His voice was calm, but it carried an authority that no one dared to challenge. "Lieutenant Colonel Doyle," he said, his words cutting through the tension. "This isn't just a good plan. This is the kind of strategic thinking that will define the future of warfare. I'm behind you 100%. A wave of shock, followed by a grudging acceptance, washed over the room. His endorsement was a shield. But for me, it was something more. It was the first time a man of my father's rank, of his generation, had looked at me and seen not a woman or a daughter, but a strategist, a peer. In that moment, he gave me something my own father never had: unconditional professional respect. A few weeks later, an invitation appeared in my inbox: lunch with General Finch. He suggested the Globe and Laurel, a restaurant near the Marine Corps base in Quantico, Virginia. It wasn't just a restaurant, it was a shrine. Every inch of its wooden walls was covered in military memorabilia, unit patches, and signed photographs of Corps legends. To any Marine, eating there was like dining in a cathedral. I expected a working lunch, a deep dive into my strategic plan. I arrived with a briefcase full of files, but as we sat down in a quiet corner booth, surrounded by the ghosts of Marine Corps history, he didn't once ask about work. Instead, he asked about me. He asked about my career path, the challenges I'd faced, the reasons I chose intelligence over a more traditional route. He listened, truly listened, with an attentiveness that was both disarming and deeply healing. He didn't interrupt. He didn't offer unsolicited advice. He simply gave me the space to tell my own story, in my own words. When I finished, he nodded slowly. "Marin," he said, his voice soft but firm, "the Marine Corps needs minds like yours. It needs your kind of courage. Don't ever let anyone, and I mean anyone, tell you that your contribution is worth less because it doesn't come from the barrel of a gun." Tears pricked my eyes, and I looked down at my water glass, fighting to maintain my composure. That single sentence was a balm on a wound I'd carried for so long I'd forgotten it was there. He had seen the invisible battles I fought every day and had given them a name: courage. That lunch was the beginning. General Finch became my mentor, my advocate, and, in a way, the father figure I had always craved. He was the first person to call when I was promoted to colonel, and later to brigadier general. When I faced a political roadblock on a critical project, a quiet phone call from his office would magically clear the path. He never asked about my family, but I always felt he knew. He saw the strength I projected to the world, but he also seemed to understand the pain I kept hidden behind it. It was General Finch who personally nominated me for the Navy Cross after the success of Operation Nightfall, the drone strike that had saved so many lives, including my brother's. I later read a transcript of his speech to the closed-door awards committee. "Courage is not only found on the battlefield with a rifle in hand," he had told them. "It is also found in a quiet command room, in the middle of the night, with the weight of 1,000 lives on your shoulders. Major General Doyle has that kind of courage." He had defined my legacy. Now, back in the present, at the ceremony at Camp Lejeune, the weight of my family's rejection felt heavy in my chest. Just before the formal proceedings began, General Finch, who had been seated in the front row, stood up and walked over to my seat in the VIP section. He leaned down, his 4-star insignia glinting on his collar. "Don't you worry about them, Major General," he whispered, his voice a low rumble meant only for me. "Today is your day. You hold your head high. The entire Marine Corps is watching you." His words were an invisible suit of armor, settling over my shoulders, protecting the bruised, aching parts of me. A sudden warmth spread through my chest, pushing back against the cold knot of loneliness. He was right. I wasn't alone. My father, mother, and brother might be across the aisle, but my family, my real family, the one forged in shared purpose and mutual respect, was right here beside me. The post-ceremony reception was a surreal ballet of contradictions. I stood in the center of the officers' club, a glass of sparkling water in my hand, feeling the warmth of General Finch's words still wrapped around me like a protective cloak. One by one, other senior officers approached, men I had admired from afar for years. They shook my hand, their grips firm and respectful, congratulating me on the Navy Cross. They spoke of Operation Nightfall in hushed, reverent tones, acknowledging the brilliance of the strategy, the lives saved. For the first time in a public setting, I felt completely and utterly seen. Across the crowded room, my own family was a dark, isolated island. My father, mother, and brother stood clustered in a corner near the bar, looking awkward and resentful. They weren't speaking to anyone, and no one was speaking to them. They were radiating a toxic energy that kept everyone at a distance. My father's arms were crossed tightly over his chest, his jaw set like granite. My mother was nervously rearranging the hors d'oeuvres on her small plate. Caleb just stared into his drink, his face a thundercloud of bruised pride. They were supposed to be celebrating his day, his silver star. But my unexpected honor had poisoned their well. Then my phone buzzed in my pocket. The screen lit up with a name that sent a jolt of anxiety through me: Mom. I excused myself from a conversation with a 2-star general, my heart pounding a nervous rhythm against my ribs. I stepped out of the noisy reception hall into a quiet, empty corridor. As I swiped to answer, A small, foolish part of me held onto a sliver of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this was it. Maybe, away from the prying eyes of my father and brother, she was calling to offer a real, private congratulations. Maybe she would finally say she was proud. That hope shattered the instant I heard her voice. There was no warmth, only the thin, reedy tone of accusation. "Marin, I cannot believe you would do this," she began, her voice trembling with manufactured distress. "You turned your brother's special day into a spectacle, all about you. Your father is mortified, the entire family is talking. Not a single word of congratulations. Not a whisper of pride, just blame." The familiar weight of it settled on my shoulders, crushing the warmth and confidence I'd felt only moments before. I took a slow, steadying breath, trying to keep my voice even. "Mom, I didn't choose the timing. The award was declassified by the Department of the Navy. I was ordered to be here." "Don't make excuses, Marin," she snapped, her voice rising. "You've always been like this, always needing to be different, always needing to prove a point. Can't you see how much this has hurt your father and your brother? A family is supposed to support each other, not compete with each other. You are tearing this family apart." There it was. The classic textbook maneuver. It was a form of psychological warfare I'd read about in intelligence manuals, a tactic designed to disorient and destabilize. Gaslighting. She was twisting reality, recasting my success as a selfish, malicious act. She was painting their jealousy and cruelty as my fault. The injustice of it was a physical thing, a bitter taste at the back of my throat. I'd spent my life being the bigger person, the one who absorbed the slights and stayed silent for the sake of a fragile peace. But now, I saw her words for what they were. Not the ramblings of a hurt mother, but the calculated weapons of a manipulator. After a sufficient dose of guilt and blame, she shifted her tactics, moving from accusation to the solution. Her voice softened, becoming syrupy with false reason. "Listen, darling," she cooed. "You need to make this right. You need to go over to your father and Caleb right now. Apologize for overshadowing his day. Tell them it was unintentional and that you'll be more humble in the future. Perhaps we can all have a nice family dinner this weekend, just us, to show everyone that we're still a united family." I felt a wave of nausea. The audacity of her request was breathtaking. She didn't just want me to deny my own achievement. She wanted me to perform an act of public self-flagellation. She wanted me to apologize for my success, to promise to shrink myself back down to a size they were comfortable with. And the family dinner? It wouldn't be for healing. It would be a photo op, a piece of theater designed to maintain their pristine public image, to prove to their social circle that the Doyles were still the perfect, unbreakable military dynasty. She wanted me to help them lie. A cold, hard anger, unlike anything I had ever felt before, began to solidify in my chest. It was the anger of a lifetime of suppressed truths, the anger of 1,000 paper cuts finally bleeding at once. But I didn't scream. I didn't argue. I had learned through years of painful experience that arguing with people who are committed to misunderstanding you is a fool's errand. It's like wrestling with a ghost. You only exhaust yourself. So I chose a new weapon: silence. I stood in the quiet hallway, listening to the faint sounds of the party on the other side of the door, and I said nothing. I let the silence stretch, letting it become a presence in the conversation, a wall she could not breach. "Marin, are you there?" she asked, her voice losing some of its confidence. "Marin, this is your responsibility as a daughter. You need to be the one to fix this." More silence. I could hear her breathing, a little faster now. The silence was unnerving her. It was a language she didn't understand. It was a refusal to play the game by her rules. "Fine," she finally spat, her voice tight with frustration. "Be that way." The line went dead. I stood there for a long moment, the phone still pressed to my ear. It felt cold, a dead piece of plastic and glass in my hand. The last, flickering ember of hope that my family could ever change had just been extinguished. It wasn't just that they didn't understand me. It was that they didn't want to. My success wasn't a source of pride for them. It was a threat to their established order. I slipped the phone back into my pocket. The invisible armor General Finch had given me was gone, stripped away by my own mother's words. But in its place, something else was forming. Something harder, colder, and far more durable. A boundary. I knew with a certainty that chilled me to the bone that from this moment on, I had to draw a line. If I didn't, I would be forever lost in their shadow, a ghost in my own life. I put the phone back in my pocket, the cold plastic a stark contrast to the fire igniting in my veins. The hallway of the officers' club, with its polished floors and portraits of decorated heroes, suddenly felt like a cage. My mother's words echoed in my head, a toxic cocktail of guilt and manipulation. For a moment, I just stood there, letting the cold, hard anger solidify inside me. It wasn't the hot, messy anger of a tantrum. It was the focused, crystalline rage of a soldier who finally understood the nature of her enemy. Just as I was about to turn and walk away, from the party, from them, from all of it, my phone buzzed again. A new text message. It was from Caleb. I braced myself as I read the words on the screen. There was no apology, no attempt at understanding, only a command, dripping with the arrogance he wore like a second skin. You've made enough of a scene. Dad is furious. Get to conference room 3. Now. We need to talk, and this time, you're going to listen. I read it twice. The sheer, unmitigated audacity of it. The tone wasn't that of a brother to a sister. It was the tone of a superior officer, a tone he had no right to use. A captain issuing a direct order to a major general. But it was more than that. It was the voice of the golden child, so secure in his position that he believed he had the right to summon me, to demand my obedience. It was the final, crushing weight on a pillar that had been cracking for years. It was the last drop. The dam broke. I didn't text back. I took a single, deep, cleansing breath. My movements became deliberate, precise. I straightened the jacket of my dress blues, smoothing a non-existent wrinkle from the sleeve. I adjusted the alignment of my ribbons, my fingers brushing over the deep blue and scarlet of the Navy Cross. This wasn't just a uniform anymore. It was armor. I turned on my heel and walked, my footsteps echoing with a purpose I hadn't felt before. I wasn't going to a family meeting. I was walking into a battle I had been avoiding my entire life. Conference room 3 was a small, windowless box, smelling faintly of stale coffee and disinfectant. The air was thick and suffocating, a perfect metaphor for my family's dynamic. And there they were, a tribunal assembled to pass judgment. My father, Donovan, stood with his arms bolted across his chest, his face a mask of thunderous rage. Caleb was pacing back and forth in the limited space like a caged tiger, radiating impatience and fury. And my mother, Genevieve, was huddled in a chair in the far corner, making herself as small as possible, her eyes fixed on the drab carpet, already a refugee from a war she refused to acknowledge. My father spoke first, his voice the familiar bark of a colonel reprimanding a disobedient subordinate. "Marine, I don't know who you think you are, or what game you're playing, but your little performance today was unacceptable." He didn't use my rank. To him, in this room, I was not a general. I was just his daughter, a problem to be managed. "You have embarrassed this family. You turned your brother's day of honor into a laughingstock." Before I could even process the absurdity of his statement, Caleb stopped pacing and jabbed a finger in my direction. "You've always been jealous of me, haven't you?" he sneered, his face twisted with a victim's righteousness. "You couldn't stand to see me succeed, to have one day that was about me, so you had to pull this stunt to steal the spotlight." And that was it. The accusation was so baseless, so profoundly ignorant of the truth of my life, that it broke through the last of my restraint. But the explosion wasn't loud. It was quiet. It was deadly. "Jealous?" I asked, my voice chillingly calm, each word a perfectly sharpened blade. "Jealous of what, Caleb? Your medal?" I took a step forward. "While you were out on patrol, earning that medal for valor, I was in a command center half a world away, making a decision that saved your entire platoon from a Taliban ambush you didn't even know was there. While you were being brave, I was being responsible for the lives of hundreds of soldiers, including yours." I let the words hang in the suffocating air. Caleb's mouth opened, then closed. For the first time in his life, he was speechless. "You speak to me of sacrifice? I continued, my voice never rising, yet filling every corner of the room. You aren't even qualified to be in the same conversation about sacrifice with me. My gaze shifted to my father. The anger on his face was beginning to curdle into confusion. And you, Dad, I said, my voice softening with a terrible final clarity. You love to talk about the Doyle legacy. But what is that legacy really? It's a legacy of favoritism, a legacy of tearing down your daughter to build up your son. I have spent 36 years of my life starving for a scrap of your approval, a single moment where you looked at me and saw something other than a disappointment. I looked at the man I had once revered, the man whose respect I had craved more than anything, and I felt nothing but a cold, hollow pity. Have you ever reached that point? That final breaking point where the silence is no longer an option and the truth is the only weapon you have left? If you know that feeling, comment the word enough below, just so I know you're with me. But I finally realized something today, I said, my voice steady. The approval of someone who is incapable of seeing your worth is, by definition, worthless. I walked to the door, my hand resting on the cool metal of the handle. I paused and turned back to face the three of them, three stunned faces frozen in a tableau of disbelief. I was no longer their daughter, their sister, their problem. I was a sovereign nation, declaring my independence. From this day forward, I said, delivering my own oath, a vow to myself. This relationship will be on my terms, or it will not be at all. I am done. I opened the door and stepped out into the hallway, leaving them behind in a vacuum of their own making. The silence that followed was absolute, and for the first time in my life, it was theirs to bear, not mine. Walking back to my hotel room, I didn't feel the triumphant rush I might have expected. The fiery rage from the conference room had cooled, settling into a state of cold, clear resolve. There were no tears. The time for tears was over. My declaration of independence had been made, and now, like any good commander after a battle, it was time to prepare for the inevitable counter-offensive. Inside the sterile quiet of my room, I placed my officer's cap on the desk with deliberate precision. I unlatched my military-issue briefcase, a hard-sided, no-nonsense case that had traveled with me across the globe. The clicks of the latches echoed in the silent room. Inside, nestled between encrypted hard drives and classified briefing books, was a single manila folder. It was my insurance policy, a file I had compiled months ago, hoping I would never need to use it. This wasn't a collection of angry emails or petty grievances. It was a file of cold, hard, undeniable facts. I slid it out and opened it on the clean surface of the hotel desk. The top document was the declassified executive summary of Operation Nightfall. I scanned the familiar paragraphs, my eyes tracing the technical language that described how my intelligence analysis had identified an imminent, large-scale ambush in Afghanistan. I paused on the key sentence, the one that mattered most. The timely and accurate intelligence provided by Major General Doyle's team directly led to the rerouting of Captain Caleb Doyle's reconnaissance platoon, preventing what was assessed to be a catastrophic loss of life. Beneath the summary was a map, the planned ambush point marked with a stark red X. There were after-action reports, timelines, and commendations from other units involved. It was the complete, unvarnished truth of what had happened that day, a truth Caleb was either unaware of or had chosen to ignore, a truth my father had never bothered to learn. I wasn't preparing this file for a lawsuit or a public exposé. That wasn't my way. This folder was a defensive weapon. It was my personal validation, a shield forged from my own work, my own competence. It was the ultimate rebuttal to their narrative of me as the jealous, paper-pushing sister. It was a weapon I would only use as a last resort if they continued to deny the reality I had just forced them to confront. Just as I was closing the folder, my phone vibrated on the desk. A new text message. My first instinct was that it was my mother, with another round of guilt-laden pleas. But the name on the screen made me pause. It was Hannah. My breath caught in my throat. I opened the message, my heart thumping with a nervous, uncertain rhythm. The text was short, but it landed with the force of a tectonic shift. Marin, I heard the conversation. I'm so sorry. I don't know what to say, but I want you to know that I believe you. I read the words again, letting them sink in. I believe you. 3 simple words that no one in my family had ever said to me. A crack of light in the suffocating darkness. For the first time, an ally had emerged from behind enemy lines. A witness. Someone who would not allow the truth to be distorted. A wave of relief, so powerful it almost buckled my knees, washed over me. The resolve in my chest hardened into something unbreakable. I was no longer fighting this war alone. I knew my father wouldn't let my final words in that conference room be the end of it. He was a man of order, of control, of established hierarchies. He would see my declaration not as a plea for respect, but as an act of insurrection. His counter-move would be predictable. He would demand a formal family meeting, a summit on his home turf in Fayetteville. It would be his last-ditch effort to reassert his authority, to force me back into the box he had built for me. In the past, I would have dreaded such a summons. I would have been sick with anxiety for days. But now I felt a strange sense of calm. I would accept his invitation. But I wouldn't be walking into that house as the prodigal daughter returning for her scolding. I would arrive as Major General Doyle. I would come to the table not as a defendant, but as an equal, armed with the one thing they could not refute, the truth. I began to plan for the meeting as I would for any military operation. Objective: to establish new, non-negotiable terms of engagement based on mutual respect. Assets: the declassified file. The support of an unexpected ally. A newfound sense of self-worth. Enemy tactics: anticipate gaslighting, emotional manipulation, appeals to tradition, and family loyalty. My strategy was simple. I would listen. I would let them say their piece. And if they chose to continue their campaign of denial and disrespect, I would present my evidence, not with anger, but with the calm, irrefutable authority of fact. That night, sleep was impossible. The city lights of Jacksonville bled through the thin hotel curtains. I sat in a chair by the window, looking out at the unfamiliar skyline, but I no longer felt the sharp sting of loneliness. My mind went back to Brené Brown, to another one of her ideas that had taken root in my soul. True belonging, she had written, only happens when we present our authentic, imperfect selves to the world. For my entire life, I had tried to belong to the Doyle family by hiding my authentic self. I had downplayed my successes, swallowed my opinions, and silenced my pain, all in a desperate attempt to fit into their narrow definition of what I should be. It had never worked. Now, I would try a different strategy. I would show up as all of me, the general, the strategist, the leader, the woman who had finally found her own voice. Whether they accepted me or not was no longer the objective. The mission was to belong to myself. And whatever the outcome of this final battle, that was a victory I'd already won. The drive to Fayetteville was a quiet one, each mile on the highway bringing me closer to the heart of my past. When I pulled into the driveway of the house I grew up in, nothing had changed. The same oak tree stood sentinel on the lawn, its branches heavy with age. The same American flag flew from the porch. But as I walked to the front door, I was not the same person who had left. I stepped into the dining room, and the air crackled with a hostility so thick I could taste it. It was a courtroom, not a home, and I was the one on trial. My father, Donovan, sat at the head of the heavy oak table, his traditional seat. But tonight he wasn't a father. He was a judge, his face set in a mask of grim authority. Caleb sat directly across from me, his jaw tight, his eyes burning with a defiant, challenging glare. My mother, Genevieve, fluttered nervously around the sideboard, pretending to be busy arranging silverware, her movements jerky and unnatural. She wouldn't look at me. And then there was Hannah. She sat beside her husband, a silent figure, but when her eyes met mine, I saw not accusation, but a flicker of worried support. It was a small comfort, but a significant one. My father began, his voice devoid of any warmth. He didn't ask how I was. He launched directly into a pre-rehearsed lecture, his words echoing the hollow sermons of my childhood. "We are a family of tradition, Marin," he started, his voice resonating with false authority. "A family of loyalty. The Marine Corps taught us that. You don't air your grievances in public. You don't disrespect the chain of command. And you certainly don't disrespect your family. You need to learn your place. You need to respect those who came before you, who paved the way for you. His words were meant to put me back in the box of the disobedient child. I let them hang in the air, offering no defense. I simply met his gaze, my expression unreadable. My silence seemed to infuriate Caleb more than any argument could have. He leaned forward, his hands flat on the table. "Who do you think you are?" he spat, his voice laced with the venom of a lifetime of perceived slights. "Coming into my ceremony, making a fool of me and Dad in front of his friends, in front of my men? Everything you have because of the Doyle name. Because of him." He gestured sharply toward our father. "Without him, you'd be a zero. Nothing." That was it. That was the signal I had been waiting for. The final, complete negation of my entire life, my every effort, my every sacrifice. It was the purest distillation of their worldview. And in that moment, I didn't feel anger. I felt a profound, almost clinical pity for him, for the boy who had been so thoroughly indoctrinated into the myth of his own superiority that he was blind to the world as it truly was. I let his words fade into the tense silence. I waited a beat, allowing the weight of his accusation to settle over the table. Then, slowly, deliberately, I reached into the briefcase beside my chair. I pulled out the thin manila folder, my secret weapon, and placed it gently in the center of the oak table. The soft whisper of the paper sliding across the polished wood was the loudest sound in the room. It was the sound of a new truth entering their world. "April 14th, I began, my voice perfectly level, clear, and devoid of emotion. 2 years ago, Korangal Valley, Afghanistan." I saw a flicker of confusion in Caleb's eyes. He knew the date. "Your platoon, Caleb," I continued, "was ordered on a routine patrol through a narrow pass. My intelligence unit, working with data from a compromised enemy network, identified a significant anomaly. A planned ambush. Over 50 Taliban fighters, armed with RPGs and heavy machine guns, were waiting for you at a designated choke point. We called it Point X." I paused, letting them absorb the information. My mother had stopped fidgeting with the silverware. My father's rigid posture seemed to falter. I issued an emergency, high-priority warning. It went against the existing intelligence on the ground, and I met with significant resistance, but I insisted. The patrol route was changed at the last minute. The after-action report, which I have right here, estimated that had your platoon proceeded as planned, your unit would have sustained casualties upwards of 70%. With a calm, steady hand, I opened the folder and slid a single piece of paper across the table toward Caleb. It was the map. A satellite image of the Rocky Valley with the patrol's original route marked in blue and a stark, brutal red X marking the location of the ambush. He stared down at it, his face draining of all color. His defiant glare dissolved into shock, then dawning horror. I looked from my brother's ashen face to my father's. "Dad's son," I said, my voice still quiet, still controlled. "Hannah's husband. He's alive today, sitting at this table because of the paperwork that you both loved to mock." I let my gaze rest on Caleb, then I turned it to my father. "I don't need a thank you," I said, my voice dropping to an almost whisper, yet carrying more power than any shout. "But I demand respect." The world seemed to stop. The air in the room became thick, heavy, unbreathable. It was a silence born of shattered realities. My father's face was a pale, waxy mask. His mouth opened, his lips moved, but no sound came out. The colonel, the patriarch, the judge had been rendered speechless. Caleb didn't look up. He just stared at the map, his head bowed as if in prayer or shame. His hands, resting on the table, slowly clenched into white-knuckled fists, the only outward sign of the war raging inside him. Across the table, I heard a sharp intake of breath. Hannah had one hand pressed to her mouth, her eyes wide with a terrifying understanding. Tears welled and spilled down her cheeks as the full, horrific weight of the truth landed on her. The man she loved, the father of her children, was alive because of the sister-in-law he had just publicly and privately humiliated. The entire myth of their family, the brave warrior son, the paper-pushing daughter, the wise and discerning father, had just crumbled to dust on their dining room table, and in its place was only a terrible, deafening silence. I stood up from the dining room table, my movements slow and deliberate. I didn't say another word. There was nothing left to say. I picked up my briefcase, turned my back on the wreckage of my family, and walked out of the room. I had imagined this moment for years. In my fantasies, it was always a scene of fiery triumph, a cinematic victory lap. But as I walked down the familiar hallway, I didn't feel the exhilarating rush of a winner. There was no elation, no sense of righteous satisfaction. There was only a vast, hollow emptiness. The adrenaline from the confrontation drained away, leaving behind a profound and bone-deep exhaustion, as if I had just completed a grueling multi-day mission. The war was over, but the cost was immense. As I reached the front door, the deafening silence behind me finally shattered. The sounds were muffled, distorted by the walls, but unmistakable. I heard my mother, Genevieve, begin to sob. Not the quiet, dignified tears of regret, but the ragged, gasping sobs of a woman whose carefully constructed world had just imploded. Her grief wasn't for my pain, it was for the destruction of her illusion of a happy family. Then I heard my father's voice, and it was a sound I had never heard before. It was stripped of all its bluster and authority, leaving only a thin, trembling thread of defeat. "Let her go," he said, his voice cracking. It wasn't an order. It was a surrender. And then, Caleb. His voice erupted, not with remorse, not with gratitude, but with pure, undiluted rage. A fist slammed against the oak table, the impact vibrating through the floorboards. "She did this to humiliate me," he roared, his denial a pathetic shield against a truth he couldn't bear to face. His final, desperate lie was the only confirmation I needed. My decision was the right one. I closed the front door behind me, the soft click sealing off the past. A week later, I was in my office at the Pentagon. The world had moved on. There were reports to analyze, briefings to attend. I was immersed in the familiar, orderly world of strategy and data, a welcome refuge from the chaos of my personal life. A letter arrived with the afternoon mail. It was a simple, cream-colored envelope. My name written on the front in my father's familiar, rigid handwriting. But this time, the usually firm, decisive strokes of his pen seemed shaky, uncertain. My hands trembled slightly as I opened it. The letter was brutally short. He didn't apologize. A man like my father didn't know how. Apology was a foreign language to him. But he wrote, "I have reviewed the reports. I was wrong in my assessment of you. I am proud of the soldier you have become." I read the words over and over. I'm proud. The 3 words I'd spent my entire life yearning to hear. The validation I'd craved more than any medal. But as I sat there, staring at the shaky ink on the page, I didn't feel the surge of joy I once would have. I only felt a deep, aching sadness, a grief for the years lost, for the relationship we could have had. The words had come, but they had come too late, after the wounds had scarred over too deeply to ever truly heal. I folded the letter carefully and drove home that evening. I took out the small wooden box from my closet, the one that held my secret history. I placed my father's letter inside, alongside the medals and commendations. It wasn't a new beginning, it was closure. The following afternoon my phone rang. It was Hannah. Her voice was quiet but filled with a steely resolve I'd never heard from her before. "Marin," she said, taking a deep breath. "I talked to Caleb. I really talked to him. He's not changing. He still thinks you did all of this to him. He can't see past his own pride." She paused, and I could hear the sound of children playing faintly in the background. "I can't live with that anymore. I can't raise my sons in a house where the man they look up to is incapable of admitting fault, or of being grateful to the person who saved his life. The boys and we're moving out for a while. I need to think." I was stunned into silence. My act of self-preservation had become a catalyst. It had unintentionally held up a mirror to her own life, giving her the strength to see the cracks in her own marriage. It was a staggering, unforeseen consequence, a testament to the powerful, unpredictable ripple effect of speaking the truth. I knew then that I had one final thing to do. This wasn't about them anymore. It was about me, about defining the terms of my own peace. I sat down at my computer and opened a new email, addressing it to my father, mother, and brother. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. This felt harder than ordering a drone strike, more fraught with danger than any decision I had ever made in a command center. I began to type. Subject: Our path forward. I am writing this because I believe we all need time and space. The foundation of our relationship has been severely damaged, and it cannot be repaired with polite phone calls or pretend family dinners. The patterns of disrespect and dismissal have run too deep for too long. I'm not cutting off contact forever, but I'm establishing a new boundary. From now on, any interaction we have must be built on a foundation of mutual respect, not the respect you give to a daughter or a sister, but the respect you give to another adult. When you are all ready and willing to do that, truly ready, you know how to reach me. Until then, please do not contact me. My finger hovered over the send button. It was a declaration of war and a treaty of peace, all in one. It was the acceptance of a great loss and the claiming of a greater freedom. I closed my eyes and clicked. As the email disappeared into the digital ether, I didn't feel sadness or anger. I felt a quiet, profound sense of release. The weight of their expectations, their judgments, their narrative, it was finally, blessedly, gone. I had stepped out of their shadow, and for the first time, I was standing in the light entirely on my own. A year passed, a year of quiet, deliberate healing. The boundary I had set was a wall of silence, and in that silence, I finally began to hear my own voice. I found myself walking through the soaring, sunlit halls of the Women in Military Service for America Memorial in Arlington. The air was still and reverent, filled with the stories of women who had served, who had fought, who had persevered. I wasn't there alone. Beside me was a young, brilliant intelligence captain, a rising star whose career I'd taken a personal interest in. We walked along the curved glass panels etched with the names and stories of servicewomen. She was telling me about a challenge she was facing, a group of older male colleagues who consistently dismissed her analysis, who patronized her in meetings. It was a story I knew by heart. I stopped and turned to face her, the light from the memorial's glass ceiling illuminating the frustration in her young face. I didn't offer her strategic advice on how to outmaneuver them. I offered her something more important, something I had learned in the crucible of my own pain. Your value is not determined by their opinion of you, I said softly. It's not determined by their approval or their acceptance. It's determined by the quality of your work and the integrity of your character. You know your analysis is sound. You know you're good at your job. Trust that. Trust yourself, especially when no one else seems to. As I spoke the words, I realized I wasn't just talking to her. I was talking to the younger version of myself, the girl who had sat at the Thanksgiving table and made herself small. In that moment, sharing the hard-won lesson, I felt the true nature of my legacy beginning to form. It wasn't about the medals in the wooden box. It was about this. It was about passing on a torch of resilience. Later that week, my phone rang. The number was unfamiliar. I hesitated, a flicker of the old anxiety returning before I answered. "General Doyle," a voice asked. It was hesitant, almost unrecognizable. It's Caleb." I stood perfectly still, my own breathing silent in my ear. He sounded like a stranger. "Hannah. She said I needed to do this myself," he stammered, the words clumsy and choked. "She said I needed to be a man and make the call. Marin. I'm sorry." He took a ragged breath. "I was a fool, an arrogant, blind fool. I owe you my life, and I owe you an apology. For everything." His voice broke on the last word, the sound raw and stripped of all its former arrogance. It wasn't a perfect apology. It wasn't a magical absolution for a lifetime of hurts. But it was real. It was a start. The boy who had never been wrong was finally admitting fault. I let the silence sit for a moment, letting him feel the weight of his own words. "Thank you for calling, Caleb," I said finally, my voice gentle. That's a start. I made no promises of reconciliation, no plans for a reunion. But for the first time, a small door, one that had been bolted shut for decades, had been nudged open. Not by force, but by a voluntary act of courage. His courage. That evening, I found myself sitting on a park bench overlooking the Potomac River. The sun was setting, painting the sky in soft hues of orange and purple. The water flowed steadily, a constant calming presence. The anger that had been my constant companion for so long was gone. The gnawing ache of resentment had dissolved. In their place was a quiet, expansive peace. I realized I had won my war. My victory wasn't in defeating my family or proving them wrong. My victory was in releasing myself from the need for their approval. It was in understanding that they were, in their own way, prisoners. My father, a prisoner of his rigid definition of strength. My mother, a prisoner of her fear of conflict. And Caleb, a prisoner of the golden boy myth he had been fed his entire life. I couldn't change them. I couldn't free them. But I could, and I had, freed myself. And in that freedom, I found I could do something I never thought possible. I could forgive. Not for them. Not to excuse their actions or to welcome them back into my life unconditionally. I forgave them for me. I forgave them to finally lay down the heavy burden of my own bitterness, a weight I had carried for far too long. As dust settled over Washington, D.C., the city lights began to twinkle across the water, like a field of fallen stars. I smiled, a genuine, unburdened smile. I thought of General Finch, the father who had chosen me. I thought of Hannah, the sister-in-law who had shown me such courage. I thought of the young captain I was now mentoring. That was my family, my chosen family. The Doyle legacy my father had obsessed over, I had finally redefined it for myself. It wasn't about bloodlines or battlefield glory or the number of stars on your collar. It was about the courage to live your own truth. It was about having a strong back to set boundaries and a soft front to let love in. It was about turning your scars into strength and using that strength to light the way for others who were still lost in the dark. My name is Major General Marin Doyle. And finally, I was free. Thank you for walking with me on this journey. My freedom didn't come from winning a battle against others, but from winning the quiet war within myself. It was the decision to define my own worth and to live authentically, even when it was the harder path. My story is just one, but I know there are millions of others out there, each with its own struggle and its own strength. If my story resonated with you, I would be honored if you shared one word in the comments that describes what freedom means to you. And if you'd like to hear more stories of resilience and hope, please subscribe to the channel and become part of our community. You are not alone.